Welcome back to the Level Up Podcast. As you may know, the Level Up Podcast was developed to facilitate real, raw, and challenging conversations with minorities about their experience in the workplace. I'm Brandon Smith, and I'm your host for today's episode. And with us, we have Deniesha Franklin. Now, Deniesha is a Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Program Manager at HubSpot, and in addition is a co-founder of Black Tech 614. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
First things first, we just wanted to know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Deniesha. I am, like you said, Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging Program Manager for HubSpot. And so within that role, I am focusing a lot on our employee resource group programming for women and people of color globally. So outside of that, I do a lot of work with Black Tech Columbus or Black Tech 614 as it relates to the tech space. I am a mother, and I don't know what else there is to say. I feel like that's that's pretty much who I am these days.
Okay. And then, so how did you get involved with the diversity and inclusion space?
My background, my bachelor's is in sociology. So I actually started school out as a nursing major, and I did that for about 2.5 years and realized that it was not for me. I think it takes a special kind of person to be a nurse, and that person was not me. So I ended up switching to sociology, which I didn't realize until later on had really a direct correlation with diversity and inclusion. So the study of human behavior essentially and figuring out what that looks like in the workplace, I think is a huge part of figuring out how we're creating more diverse and inclusive workspaces. So in my first role out of college, I was an IT recruiter, and that's when I started to realize that the world of kind of corporate diversity and inclusion even existed. And so once I realized that, then I started to get more into it, started to get involved in diversity and inclusion at any chance I could. And that was really my initial introduction to D&I.
Okay, interesting. So did you kind of feel like there were challenges with recruiting diverse individuals in your role as a tech recruiter?
100%. I think a lot of the challenges more so though, for me, were less about being able to find diverse talent and actually being able to properly advocate for them when it came to getting them into different roles and making sure that they were viewed for different opportunities. And so I think a lot of the times the kind of misconception is that there's this lack of talent from underrepresented groups, which isn't necessarily true. I think a big piece of it is being able to create access to opportunities for those from different underrepresented communities.
Okay. And then really just diving a little bit more into that, what would you say diversity means to you specifically?
Um, well, I always I always tell people that to me the word diversity is just a word that is a measurement. So when you think about diversity, literally it just means the presence of difference. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace specifically, it's really more so just talking about whether or not we have more than one type of, I guess in this case it would be person, but that could mean a ton of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be race or even gender or that sort of thing. You could have, all Black people and one white person. Technically, that would be diversity. And I think I think that's the way that I look at diversity itself.
Okay. And then, so getting into your role now, has it kind of shifted maybe your perspective on what diversity was? Because as you said, like it isn't just gender or race, but it can also be like ability, like so individuals who might be, in wheelchairs or might not have, certain cognitive functions or anything like that. Like, has that really shifted your perspective?
Absolutely. I think that in a couple of ways it shifted it. So one, I have a totally different perspective now being a mother. And so what that means for diversity and inclusion and creating spaces for parents to be able to participate in, even if it's an activity like during the day or in the early morning or at the end of the day. And so I have an infant, and so it's a little bit different for me, but even if you think about parents who are now homeschooling and what does that mean for them. I also have ADHD, which I talk about openly and freely, which significantly impacts a lot of the work that I do. So when you think about folks with different abilities and we talk about accessibility, I think that's a huge piece that More recently, especially with working from home, has been kind of forefront, top of mind for me personally. And then in my current role with HubSpot, so we have um, close to 5,000 employees globally. And so for me, diversity and inclusion no longer just means I'm used to taking that North American lens and just having to focus on people who are in the Eastern Standard Time. Whereas now I'm working to make sure that our folks in Singapore and Tokyo and Dublin, Ireland are all able to meet at the same, well, I won't say at the same time because that will never happen. But I did take that into account when I'm programming to make sure that inclusion means something totally different now. And so global inclusivity is something that I am learning to be better at and something that I'm spending a lot of time focused on.
And that's really interesting that you kind of mentioned the global aspect of things. And I want to understand, so how do people from like offices like within like Singapore or like any other country that is in that works for HubSpot, how do they see diversity? Do you think they have more focus on like gender diversity in Singapore? Or maybe is there still like a lot of emphasis on that racial diversity, nationality diversity, anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that we as a team actually right now are looking into and working to better educate ourselves on. So I would say that one of the things that we quickly learned, so when you think about people of color, so one of our ERGs that I'm responsible for is called POCA, which is People of Color at HubSpot. And when you think about the fact that the term people of color doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone, whereas when we use it here in the US, we typically are using it to refer to anyone that's not white. And so when you think about Singapore, um, folks don't resonate with the term people of color. And then they also don't necessarily resonate with the term white. So it's like kind of put us in this, what we would consider a gray space, but really it's this whole different aspect of peoples and identities and that sort of thing. And so it's really interesting because I think in Singapore specifically, um, I think they're much further along than we realize. And when I say we, I just mean us in the US. And they definitely are, I think they are more less focused on racial diversity or ethnic diversity and a lot more focused, I would say, on gender diversity and even LGBTQ plus issues and that sort of thing. So you have that, and then I think it's interesting because that differs even within that space. It differs from region to region. So where folks in Tokyo are on their journey of gender inclusion is different than where people in Singapore are, than where we are in the US and so on. So it's really interesting, actually. It's been a cool way to start to kind of expand my knowledge and just continue to learn more, which I think is one of the coolest things about the space in general. But I would say it's interesting how things change from space to space.
Wow, that is really amazing to hear about because, like, again, never really considered diversity and inclusion outside of the United
Yeah.
States. So having that global perspective, that's amazing, really. And I guess segueing into my next topic, I wanted to understand kind of what do you see as before the passing of George Floyd, which is kind of the main topic of this podcast episode, how would you describe the attitudes of diversity and inclusion within corporate America and possibly if you have a global perspective, that as well?
Yeah, when George Floyd was killed, I was actually out on maternity leave, and um, it was an interesting time. So I had started to see perspectives for diversity and inclusion shift over the probably I would say 2.5 to 3 years that I'd been within the corporate space, and so I think that it was seen as something that was a nice to have. It wasn't necessarily a necessity, and folks felt like if they had a diversity and inclusion team or person, then they were kind of ahead of the curve. So, and I think, I mean, for what it's worth, that probably was the case just based on what the industry looked like. So there were very few places that had, a person that was responsible for diversity and inclusion, let alone a team. So it was very much so something that was, hey, this is we're doing really really good by having this, or we have ERGs, which again great things, but I think that obviously once George and I say this I think the best way to look at it is for me, and the way that I've been able to kind of put it into perspective is that when before George Floyd was murdered and we had, kind of everything happening with COVID and folks were unfortunately being laid off, companies had to make tough decisions. Diversity and inclusion professionals were a lot of times, from what I was seeing on LinkedIn and from what I was hearing, those were the first folks to go. And those were kind of seen as the not
Like overhead, so to
yeah.
speak.
hmm And so those folks were seen as the nice to have. Like those weren't essential. Like those weren't your salespeople. Those weren't your finance people or whatever it could be. And then when we look at a couple of months later, literally what 2 months later, and George Floyd is murdered, and now there's just this abundance of diversity and inclusion positions, and it's like the irony of it all, and in how that kind of mindset shifts, just from, I won't say just because that's a major thing, but like just from seeing that happen, and now all of a sudden like those are the most important roles. So I think it's an interesting paradigm when you look at it that way.
And I guess that brings up an interesting point in the fact that so we were having kind of like issues economically with COVID, and that makes sense and everything like that. But how is it that we didn't have the funds for these positions, and then suddenly some widespread social issue is being suddenly like looked at really heavily, and suddenly there is money for it? It's like it's just interesting because it's like it isn't the same thing as IT. It's like we need more servers, we need more people to manage the servers. It's not really the same thing. So
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and your guess is as good as mine. I'd love to know where the money came from. But I think it was really just one of those things where, and this is where I have mixed feeling, is that it was kind of at this point, it was a must have. Like it was no longer a nice to have. Like you must do something at this point, whether you care about it genuinely or you want to save face with your customer base and your internal employee base. So I feel like companies were finally put in a position where they didn't really have a choice, whether that was hiring someone from a full-time perspective or getting a diversity and inclusion council or committee, which I have complete other ideas on or thoughts about. I think it was really the first time where organizations were going to be held accountable, which again, I have mixed feelings about, just because this is something that usually, in my experiences, isn't going to work unless people are fully bought in, unless people actually believe in what it is that in the work that you're doing within the space.
yeah, it's difficult for it to really have a impact if it seems ham-fisted, quote unquote, to some certain individuals. And
Mhm.
I definitely think sometimes with some companies, they can, I guess, like they have the right idea and everything like that, but it can kind of like polarize individuals who are already on the fence. So like it's
Mhm.
definitely like a very like a fine line between what is helpful and what is unhelpful. And I
Right.
guess that actually does bring me to my next point, another segue. Since his passing, what have you seen as kind of the steps that both your company and other companies that you might have viewed have taken to, I guess, address these issues of systemic racism,
Yeah.
edit that out,
No, you're fine.
gender inequality, and then other social injustices?
Yeah. So when everything first happened, I was on maternity leave and I was actually at a different organization. So I've been at HubSpot for I think today's my 5 month anniversary actually. So about 5 months now. But at that time, I was seeing a lot of organizations who were kind of getting folks together within the organization, whether it be all of the Black folks within the organization, or whether it was everyone to come together and kind of listen to how Black people were feeling at that time. And I think that that was what I saw a lot of places do to start. I also was seeing a lot of organizations putting out statements saying, hey, we support the Black community, Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. Um, and I think that was really the first step, and for unfortunately many organizations, maybe the last step that they took in that during that time. Now, what I will say is that for HubSpot, for me, it truly is like I don't even know what to call it. It was a hidden blessing, honestly, because coming here for me when I was, pre George Floyd, I was working within the technology space. So I had been considering working or wanting to work full time within the diversity and inclusion space. But again, it was a very hard industry to break into prior to this, especially if you didn't have 100 years of experience beforehand. So it was something that I had kind of put off to the back burner and was like, oh, well, I'll think about this at another time. And so then that kind of accelerated for me in that sense. And HubSpot was already doing so many amazing things once I got here. And so as a result of George Floyd's murder, we did actually have something called our Black Lives Matter action plan. And so within that, there are just several different things, several different aspects that we have been working on in order to make sure that we are kind of walking the walk and saying that we support Black employees, that Black Lives Matter, and whether that be from, recruiting, retention, inclusion. We created Black Hub, which is our newest Black ERG. Just a lot of very intentional things. We created a Black advisory board that was recently announced. So just
Wow.
being very intentional about how we are approaching this and how we're making sure that we always say walking the walk and really actually proving um, proving our actions behind our statement, if that makes sense.
Wow. That's definitely very different from, I guess, some of the experiences. I'm not going to like name any names or anything like that, but myself and some other people that I have in my professional network, I've definitely heard some stories of like some companies who are doing like sort of like maximum, like
Yeah,
for companies example. So thank goodness for them. And in other cases, it's kind of like they have these like monthly meetings where they gather all of the minority employees together and say, so how are you guys feeling?
yeah,
Everything good? And then they're not really doing anything else. And
yeah,
that's fine because I mean, at the bare minimum, people do deserve to have their voices heard, but at the same time, if you're a company making this much a year and you can't make positive changes for the very least your employees, other than having a wall to talk to,
yeah.
it's it's hard to, I guess, really be sold on that they're making positive impact.
Definitely. And I think it's a slippery slope too, because it's one thing, to your point, it's one thing to listen or create a space for folks to share. But if you're not actually listening or retaining that and then taking it and doing something with it, I would say that that can potentially have a negative impact, which I think is why I always say that diversity without inclusion, or even diversity without belonging, is really can have can backfire on you, honestly. So if you bring more people of color, if you bring more Black people into the workplace, but once they get here, they feel like they're talking to a wall, their voices aren't heard, then they're going to leave. And so it kind of you lose money that way, if we're being honest. When you think about the amount of money that it costs to replace employees, to recruit, to train, to get folks up to speed, like then you're losing money. And so if we're not first investing in our internal employees, the employees that we already have, it's not going to matter how many prospective candidates we bring in, if they don't want to stay there. So I totally agree, and almost would say that if you're not planning on doing anything with your employees' feedback, maybe don't even hold those spaces, because that can be a point of frustration if you think about it. If you're constantly going to a meeting and telling how you feel, but nothing is coming of it, I would probably be more frustrated than if I were to just not say anything at all.
Yeah, I definitely have had experiences beforehand. I'm not going to confirm that it was based on my race or anything like that. I don't want it to be, but
Mhm.
I definitely feel like I was included in certain spaces, and then once I got there, like my opinion wasn't valued. So it's kind of like
Yeah,
you brought me to the table, but now I can't eat, and
exactly.
it
Exactly.
is it's just interesting because that creates a whole entire new like psychological like phenomenon. It's like, do I deserve to be here? Did they only
Mhm.
pick me because of X, Y, and Z? And it's just like
Right.
that's not good for those individuals who have been, I guess, chosen to be representatives of their population. It's
Right.
a very complex issue. It really is.
It is, and in that point specifically, I would say, like, you can have a seat at the table, or I can have a seat at the table, but do I have a voice at the table? And so for me, I don't want to sit at a table where no one's going to listen to me and where people are going to just be talking over me. And I think, to your point, that's what we see a lot of times, where it's like, well, hey, I brought so and so to the meeting. The table itself is diverse, but once so and so gets there, how do they feel sitting at that table? And I think that's where a lot of organizations get caught up, is because, again, it's not just about diversity in numbers, it's about the inclusiveness of the diversity. If like I think that's the best way to describe it. It's you've got to actually include people if you're going to benefit from diversity and inclusion.
So that does bring me to my final question. And I mean, this is kind of like a very big question, but I mean, what final action items could we take away from this conversation, especially for the audience at home or maybe watching?
I have a laundry list of action items. um, I would say the first thing would be to really listen and find out what your employees want. So if we're talking about employers, especially within a corporate space, I would say don't assume that you know what employees need. Um, Find out what they need, ask them what they need, and include them when you're solving for whatever those issues are. And so for many organizations, a lot of organizations don't have teams for diversity and inclusion specifically. So if you can't get headcount for bringing on people full time, that would be my second thing. Have people, not just a person, people dedicated to this work. So right now we have a team of 7 people just within diversity and inclusion. And so there are some of us who are focused more so on like internal employee programming. There are some of us who are focused more on our specific company pillars, so like finance, sales, that sort of thing. And so there's different aspects of what that looks like. Because again, diversity and inclusion needs are going to be nuanced depending on whatever it is that you're talking about at the time. You could be talking about teams, you could be talking about specific groups of people within the organization as a whole. It really just depends. So I would say try to find headcount, and if that's not in the books or is not a possibility, I would say make sure that you are, if you have ERGs, listening to your ERG leaders and supporting them and providing them with the budget. That would probably be like a tie for number one is like budget. You have to, it costs money, like you have to spend money on this, and you have to be willing to do so. So I think that those are some of the first things that I would do. And really, I say first, but those are ongoing things. And I think that the way that those progress throughout time will change just depending on where your organization is. But it's always going to require money. It's always going to require people to carry out the work, to execute on the work. And it's really just going to require a commitment. So if this isn't something that's included in your team's performance reviews, if this isn't something that's included in your company's overall strategic goals for the year, like that's where we should be at in order to be able to bolster a level of true accountability. Because it's easy to say, yeah, we care about diversity and inclusion. And year over year, we see, even if you look at some of these big tech companies, year over year, we see them having all these crazy programs, like really things that seem really cool for women and people of color and all this stuff. But if you look at the numbers year over year, they're not moving, and a lot of times they're actually regressing. So it's
Mm.
really the conversation of intent versus impact. So yeah, all these programs and all this stuff is great, but what impact is it actually having? And again, I think a big piece of that comes down to actually listening to your employees instead of assuming what they need, ask them what they need, and then include them in that.
And one thing that I'll add to that point is that a lot of these things, these initiatives require like sponsorship from like those at the higher level, because
Mhm.
I feel like they can put in everything that you're talking about in place, but if there's not like buy-in from those at the top, if they really
Yeah.
don't care, then at some point it's going to slip and everything's going to fall apart. It really requires like enthusiastic sponsorship, not just like, rubber stamp is like, all right, do
Right.
whatever you need to do.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of this work, and I hate to say it, but a good majority of this work is about optics, and it's about how folks in the organization perceive diversity and inclusion. And a big piece of that is making sure that you have, like you said, that executive sponsorship. So like for ERGs, for example, every ERG should have an executive sponsor that is a C-level C-suite member. And I wholeheartedly believe that. And I've been fortunate enough that the last, HubSpot in my previous organization, we had that. And I think that is a big piece of whether or not folks will get engaged and whether or not folks are going to to commit to diversity and inclusion, because as much as I would love for, this to just be something that is innate, everyone's not going to be passionate about diversity and inclusion. Everyone's not going to want to be a part of it. Everyone's not going to believe in it. And we would be very naive to think otherwise. And so I think the work that we do really has to be focused on creating more diverse, inclusive, and equitable processes and systems so that it doesn't really matter who is running them. If we have that built into our processes, then again, it's not going to matter who's running them. It's going to be something that's ingrained and embedded within our organization. So that's the direction I think we need to move towards. It's great to focus on people as individuals and making sure people are understanding diversity and inclusion. But the big picture here to me is that making sure our systems and our processes are diverse and equitable.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that's about all the time we have. So to all the viewers at home, thank you so much for enjoying, for listening in on our conversation, and I hope you enjoyed. And as always, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more details on all things level D&I. Thank you.